Judy Garland. Judy Garland was more than a Hollywood icon. She was a tragic symbol of the industry's darkest excesses. Rising to stardom as a teenager, she was thrust into the spotlight under the suffocating grip of MGM Studios. Behind the glittering premieres and orchestral ballads was a child, relentlessly controlled. Studio executives, desperate to maintain her youthful image, subjected her to substances to suppress her appetite and keep her awake during grueling filming schedules. Sedatives were then prescribed to help her sleep, trapping her in a vicious cycle of dependency before she even reached adulthood. This pharmaceutical control was so severe that she reportedly could not function on set without the pills, setting the foundation for a lifelong addiction. Lesser known is how, by her early 20s, her addiction led to a string of career collapses, including being fired from major productions for unreliability, each setback compounding her emotional fragility. Garland's struggle extended beyond the set. She endured repeated institutionalizations in psychiatric hospitals and multiple attempts in taking her own life, each incident further concealed by the studio's carefully controlled press narratives. Her failed marriages, including her tumultuous relationship with Sid Luft, mirrored the instability within her career. Garland's earnings were also mishandled, leaving her financially unstable despite massive success. Her death, officially ruled as an accidental overload in the summer of 1969, was the tragic endpoint of a life sculpted and shattered by the very machine that made her famous. Yet, the emotional devastation she endured was not unique in her era, hinting at the systemic exploitation rampant in Hollywood's golden age. Montgomery Clift. Montgomery Clift's legacy is often reduced to his matinee idol looks and magnetic screen presence, but his life was far more complicated and far darker. Behind the brooding performances and classic roles lay a man consumed by trauma. Clift's addiction spiraled after a near-fatal car accident in the mid-1950s, which left his face partially disfigured and his confidence shattered. To numb the constant pain, he turned to alcohol and prescription painkillers, an addiction that corroded both his health and his career. Few know the depths of his emotional torment. Struggling with his sexual identity in a time when Hollywood thrived on projecting heteronormative ideals, Clift was haunted by a sense of isolation. His substance abuse became a shield against personal truths he was forced to suppress publicly. Even close friends described his later years as a slow-motion attempt to take his own life, with his self-destructive habits becoming increasingly unmanageable. Despite attempts at comebacks, such as his role in Judgment at Nuremberg, his deteriorating health overshadowed his talent. His final performance, a shadow of his former self, hinted at the toll the years of self-destruction had taken, exposing a truth deeper than his on-screen persona. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn embodied the swashbuckling, devil-may-care rogue on screen, but his off-screen reality was a descent into self-destruction. The dashing hero of Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood lived in excess, booze, drugs, and scandal. His addiction to alcohol was notorious, fueling public incidents of violence, reckless behavior, and a decline so sharp it became impossible to separate the actor from the character. Lesser known was his fixation on opiates, which he reportedly relied on to dull persistent health issues. His reckless lifestyle caught up with him early. By his 40s, Flynn was financially ruined and blacklisted by studios wary of his volatility. His physical decline was so pronounced that he began seeking smaller roles just to maintain income, often borrowing money from friends. Rumors of affairs with underage girls only added to his tarnished image, a pattern of scandal that followed him to his death. His death in the late 1950s, officially listed as a heart attack, was complicated by decades of substance abuse that had aged him well beyond his years. The fall of Flynn shattered the illusion that charisma could outshine addiction, a lesson echoed by another tragic figure of the era, as Hollywood's glittering facade continued to mask its destructive underbelly. Alma Rubens. Alma Rubens epitomized the silent film era's shimmering allure, but behind the glamour lay a devastating spiral into addiction that would ultimately consume her. Rising to fame during the 1920s, she dazzled audiences with her beauty and talent, becoming one of Hollywood's most sought-after actresses. Yet few knew the private turmoil lurking behind her public persona. Her prescription substance addiction began in her early 20s, initially prescribed to manage pain from chronic health issues. However, her dependency rapidly escalated, leading to erratic behavior, missed filming schedules, and a growing reputation for being unreliable. Arrested multiple times for drug possession, she faced public humiliation that overshadowed her once illustrious career. Her chaotic personal life was just as tragic, marked by a highly publicized divorce and a series of mental breakdowns that kept her in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. The studio system, eager to protect its investment, often concealed the true extent of her addiction while profiting from her image. Rubens's attempts at recovery were sabotaged by the era's limited understanding of addiction, with treatments often involving isolation rather than therapy. Despite multiple stints in rehabilitation and desperate attempts to reclaim her former glory, Rubens' health continued to decline. By the early 1930s, her addiction had stripped away both her stardom and personal stability. She died at the age of 33, a stark reminder of how the film industry's demand for perfection often masked deeper struggles that few could escape, even in their prime. Robert Mitchum. Robert Mitchum projected a rugged, unshakable masculinity on screen, but behind that tough exterior lay a far more complicated and vulnerable reality. His addiction to cannabis was an open secret long before his highly publicized 1948 arrest for possession, an event that could have derailed his entire career. Instead, the scandal fueled his rebellious persona, making him even more marketable as a Hollywood bad boy. Yet, the defiant image masked emotional wounds dating back to his traumatic childhood. Orphaned early, he experienced profound instability, poverty, and repeated run-ins with the law as a young man. Forced into manual labor to survive, he drifted across the country before finding his way into acting almost by accident. Substance use became a way to numb unresolved pain, and despite his success, it impacted his professional relationships. Directors grew frustrated with his erratic behavior on set, which often involved showing up late or under the influence. He frequently minimized his struggles in interviews, playing up his image as carefree rather than tormented. His personal life was equally turbulent, with infidelity and emotional distance defining his relationships. Mitchum's death in 1997 marked the end of a career defined as much by personal chaos as cinematic brilliance. A reminder that fame often amplifies rather than heals personal trauma. His story, however, was not as deeply masked as another Hollywood titan's. Humphrey Bogart. Humphrey Bogart was the very image of a classic Hollywood tough guy, but behind his steely exterior lay profound emotional struggles and substance dependence that few truly understood. Rising to stardom in the 1930s, his performances exuded strength and confidence. But off-screen, his battle with alcoholism told a different story. By the 1940s, his drinking had become excessive, with reports of him consuming alcohol daily, often affecting his behavior on set and performance consistency. Beyond the addiction was a deeply scarred personal life. His tumultuous marriage to actress Mao Methot was marked by alcohol-fueled altercations, including physical fights and public scandals that earned them the nickname the Battling Bogarts. His eventual marriage to Lauren Bacall brought temporary stability, yet the damage was already deeply ingrained. Bogart's reliance on alcohol had long since impacted his health. Heavy smoking and drinking ultimately led to a diagnosis of esophageal cancer in the early 1950s, a disease exacerbated by his unchecked lifestyle. His health rapidly deteriorated, and his physical decline became visible in his final film roles. His death in 1957, just months after being awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award, was the tragic conclusion to a life where strength and vulnerability blurred completely, exposing how even the toughest personas could crack under the weight of addiction. Bela Lugosi. Bela Lugosi, forever immortalized as the definitive Dracula, suffered a nightmarish fate off-screen that rivaled any horror role he portrayed. Behind the haunting eyes and aristocratic presence lay a man gripped by prescribed substances. His struggles began after World War I, when injuries from his time serving in the Austro-Hungarian army left him in chronic pain. The prescribed opiates intended to ease his suffering instead consumed him. His Hollywood career soared in the early 1930s with the success of Dracula, yet personal demons followed closely behind. As his career waned, the addiction deepened, forcing him into a cycle of low-budget horror films and personal disgrace. Publicly, Lugosi denied the extent of his problem, but privately, his financial ruin and dependency were overwhelming. His addiction impacted his professional relationships, with directors reluctant to cast him despite his talent. He was eventually forced to accept roles far beneath his skill just to afford his habit. His personal life suffered equally, marked by multiple divorces and a strained relationship with his son. In a shocking turn, he voluntarily admitted himself to rehab in 1955, a rare act of transparency for the era. This public admission was groundbreaking, exposing the depth of his struggles at a time when addiction was heavily stigmatized. Lugosi's death in 1956, clad in his Dracula cape, symbolized the collapse of both a myth and a man consumed by his inner darkness. Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe, Hollywood's most iconic blonde bombshell, was not merely a victim of fame, but of a system designed to exploit vulnerability. Rising from a traumatic childhood marked by foster care and emotional neglect, Monroe was catapulted into global stardom. Studios controlled her image with ruthless precision, demanding physical perfection while suppressing her emotional turmoil. When insomnia and emotional pain plagued her, the solution was a dangerous cocktail of various substances. Her dependency worsened under the glare of fame, each scandal and failed relationship amplifying her need for escape. Studios turned a blind eye as Monroe spiraled, masking her instability with carefully staged public appearances. Lesser known is the extent to which Monroe was surveilled by government agencies due to her relationships with powerful figures, adding paranoia to her already fragile state. Her struggles with self-worth were further complicated by powerful men who saw her as a commodity rather than a person, including being manipulated into exploitive contracts that stifled her creative ambitions. Her attempts at serious dramatic roles were repeatedly undermined, forcing her back into the stereotype of the blonde seductress. Her death in 1962, ruled as a probable overload of substances, was shrouded in speculation, many questioning whether it was an accident or something far more sinister. Her fate remains one of Hollywood's most enduring mysteries, fueled by a system built on exploitation. Charlie Chaplin. Charlie Chaplin, the beloved master of silent cinema, harbored a complex personal life haunted by scandal and emotional turbulence. While his on-screen persona as the tramp captivated millions, his off-screen behavior often invited controversy. Accusations of inappropriate relationships with underage women shadowed his career, eventually leading to legal battles and public outcry. Chaplin's personal struggles were equally profound. Lesser known was his dependency on alcohol during his most stressful periods, using it as a crutch to manage public scrutiny and creative pressures. His reliance on alcohol often interfered with his directorial focus, leading to tensions on set and periods of erratic behavior. His exile from the United States in the early 1950s, following accusations of communist sympathies, compounded his emotional isolation, forcing him into a life of self-imposed exile in Switzerland. There, he continued working but retreated further from public life, haunted by both professional controversies and personal regrets. His later years were defined by reflection and distance, rarely engaging with the media despite his legendary status. Chaplin's complicated legacy reveals a genius both celebrated and deeply troubled, reminding the world how fame can distort even the most enduring legacies. His artistic brilliance remains unmatched, but the scandals surrounding his personal life linger, exposing the fragile duality of greatness and human vulnerability. Fatty Arbuckle. Fatty Arbuckle was once among the highest-paid and most beloved comedians of the silent film era, but his career was irreparably shattered by scandal. His fall began in the early 1920s during a fateful Labor Day weekend party at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco, where aspiring actress Virginia Rappe died under mysterious circumstances. Arbuckle faced serious legal accusations that dominated headlines across the nation, sparking a media frenzy. Though he was acquitted after 3 trials, the damage was catastrophic. His reputation was eviscerated, and the press branded him a monster, fueling a moral panic about Hollywood's excesses. The details were sensationalized, yet few knew that Rappe had pre-existing health issues unrelated to Arbuckle's actions. Behind the scandal lay another destructive truth: Arbuckle's increasing dependency on alcohol. As his career imploded, his drinking intensified, leading to further professional decline. Studios, wary of public backlash, blacklisted him, forcing him into poverty despite the immense fortune he had once amassed. Isolated and vilified, Arbuckle attempted a quiet comeback under the pseudonym William Goodrich, directing minor films while the industry kept its distance. His death from a heart attack in 1933, at the age of 46, was the tragic culmination of years of public humiliation, personal despair, and unresolved grief. The scandal's aftershocks continued, reshaping Hollywood's moral code and public perception of celebrity misconduct. Gene Tierney. Gene Tierney was the epitome of Hollywood glamour in the 1940s, celebrated for her striking beauty and magnetic performances. Yet, behind the flawless facade lay profound emotional turmoil and a heartbreaking descent into mental health struggles worsened by substance dependency. Tierney's life changed forever after contracting rubella during a public event in the early 1940s, which tragically resulted in her daughter being born with severe disabilities, including hearing loss and developmental delays. Consumed by guilt and grief, Tierney's mental health spiraled, leading her to seek solace in alcohol and sedatives. The pressures of fame, relentless press scrutiny, and the demands of perfection magnified her suffering. Hollywood's response was cruelly indifferent. Tierney was cast in roles demanding elegance and poise, masking the emotional breakdown unfolding behind the scenes. Lesser known is how Tierney voluntarily admitted herself to multiple psychiatric institutions during the 1950s, where she endured electroconvulsive therapy, a brutal and controversial treatment at the time that further eroded her sense of self. The emotional toll was immense, yet the studio system continued to push her into glamorous roles while concealing her fragile state. Though she made brief career comebacks, including a standout role in Advise and Consent, her life remained marked by sorrow, a haunting example of Hollywood's obsession with perfection masking personal devastation. Gene Eagles. Gene Eagles, a stage and silent film star whose name was once synonymous with raw intensity and artistic brilliance, lived a life consumed by addiction and personal tragedy. Rising to fame on Broadway in the 1920s, her haunting performances and striking beauty captivated audiences, but behind the spotlight, she was unraveling. Eagles' dependency on substances and alcohol began as a method to manage the relentless stress of fame and the physically exhausting demands of live theater. But it soon spiraled out of control. Her addiction deepened, resulting in unpredictable behavior and frequent absences from performances, tarnishing her once illustrious reputation. The press shielded much of her struggle, yet insiders knew she was barely holding on, relying on substances just to function on stage. Lesser known is how Eagles was one of the first prominent actresses to openly battle addiction at a time when substance abuse was taboo, making her a pioneer of Hollywood's hidden struggles. Her addiction ultimately led to her untimely death in 1929, at the age of 39, from an overload of substances, though the press softened the truth by citing exhaustion. The reality was far darker. Her death was a consequence of both personal pain and an industry that turned a blind eye to its stars' suffering. Jean Eagle's tragic end served as an early cautionary tale, yet Hollywood's cycle of exploitation and silence continued for generations. Juanita Hanson. Juanita Hanson, once a rising star in the silent film era, seemed destined for cinematic greatness. Her beauty and screen presence captivated audiences, but the darker forces lurking behind her career were quietly unraveling her life. Hanson's struggles with dependency began after being prescribed medication for an injury in the late 1910s. What followed was a harrowing descent into substance dependency, fueled by a film industry that offered little compassion for personal struggles. By the early 1920s, her addiction was common knowledge among insiders, yet the public remained unaware. Studios distanced themselves, eroding her once promising career. Lesser known was her courageous attempt to reclaim her life. Hanson became an early advocate for addiction recovery, speaking publicly about her struggles long before it was acceptable in Hollywood. Yet her efforts were met with industry silence, and she was effectively blacklisted. She spent her later years lecturing on the dangers of substance abuse, yet her cinematic legacy was largely forgotten. Her story stands as both a cautionary tale and a beacon of personal redemption, revealing how Hollywood's silent era concealed personal tragedies beneath its glamorous exterior. Richard Burton. Richard Burton's voice could command any screen, yet his internal battles raged far louder. Rising to fame in the mid-20th century, his Shakespearean roots and brooding presence made him a cinematic powerhouse. Yet alcohol consumed his personal life, a habit formed long before his Hollywood fame. Burton's addiction wasn't just a personal vice, but an open secret in the industry. It strained his professional relationships, causing erratic behavior on set and costly production delays. His tumultuous marriages to Elizabeth Taylor were filled with public displays of passion and volatility, with alcohol fueling many of their infamous clashes. What many overlook is how Burton used alcohol as a shield against profound self-doubt, despite his acclaim. Lesser known was how his drinking nearly cost him major roles, including being passed over for projects despite his fame. His health deteriorated rapidly in his later years, culminating in his death from a cerebral hemorrhage in 1984, a tragedy compounded by decades of alcohol abuse. His legacy remains a paradox of brilliance overshadowed by personal demons, a narrative that echoes through the corridors of Hollywood's history of excess. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our newest videos. Thanks for watching.